The PlayStation 1 sits in an interesting position in the retro gaming space. It's in a generation of consoles which are often overlooked by most people, and even then, the N64 seems to get most of the attention for a whole lot of reasons that I've already gotten into before. But one interesting point of discussion I've seen quite often was, is X possible on the PlayStation 1, or is Y possible on the N64? It's often a fair question asked by people who genuinely don't know, but quite a few times I've seen it co-opted by fanboys with quite laughable claims. So, in this video, I wanted to set the record straight. First of all, the biggest limitation of the N64 was the RAM bandwidth and storage size. The N64 has one big blob of RAM, those being 4MB of RDRAM, and this RAM already has quite high latency, but as it's only one bank of RAM, only one component can access it at any one time, so the CPU and GPU will have to waste a lot of time waiting for the RDRAM to be free. This is compounded with the 8-bit bus connecting the RAM to the rest of the system, and in comparison, the PS1 had separate RAM, VRAM, and audio RAM, and the RAM bus was 32-bit. And if you're wondering, the expansion pack doubles the RAM to 8MB, but it doesn't actually add it anywhere else in the system, it basically enlarges the same bank. So it doesn't help with the existing RAM throughput issues. And the issues caused by less storage are self-explanatory. The biggest limitations of the PS1 is the main system memory and a more primitive rasterizer. The total RAM of the PS1 and N64 were relatively similar, those being 3.5 and 4MB, but because the PS1 only has 2MB of system RAM, it can be an issue. The more primitive rasterizer lacks a Z-buffer and perspective-correct texture mapping, meaning it requires an ordering table, intelligent culling, and tessellation to provide good-looking 3D visuals. Now, you might have noticed I didn't mention the N64 texture cache or the PS1's disk speed. That's because those two were very rarely the limiting factor in terms of game design. The texture cache didn't really limit the creative vision developers had, as you could just get away with using uglier textures, while the disk speed just resulted in somewhat worse loading times, which funnily enough the N64 also ended up having because numerous N64 games just had to compress data, which resulted in some depressively long loading times. Compare that to the numerous PS1 games that also used data streaming to basically eliminate loading times, something that the N64 games also did, and you can kind of see how, realistically, the loading speed isn't an issue. Now, let's ask a few questions. Question 1. Which games are just flat out impossible on either platform? The types of games impossible on the PS1 are games that require either a huge amount of CPU power, or a lot of system RAM, or continuously drawing very high resolution textures from the cartridge directly, though the latter is only present in homebrew demos. StarCraft 64's Brood War expansion requires the expansion card, while games like DK64 use it to store vertex lighting data. And of course, some games like Majora's Mask or Perfect Dark use it to load larger levels. Now, some of these can be worked around. You could just chop up a level in Majora's Mask or Perfect Dark or Donkey Kong 64 if it doesn't fit into RAM, kinda like Quake 2 on the PS1, and you can also dynamically load levels like Soul Reaver or Crash Bandicoot. There's a lot you can do to remedy the 2MB limitation. The issue you cannot remedy is if games like StarCraft 64 need the entire RAM for things that aren't just the level, but instead units that need to constantly stay loaded at all times. It's just not possible to do in the 2MB of RAM the PS1 has. The types of games that were impossible on the N64 are games that require of loading and storing a large amount of data and everything related to it. That is why so few RPGs came to the system. Of course, these things could be worked around with larger cartridges to a point, though results may vary in terms of quality significantly, and while data compression works, it kills the loading times that cartridges allow for, low-resolution textures, lower quality sound, less music, lower quality MIDI samples, less content, and other problems are also results of this kind of compression work, or trying to squeeze a game down into the cartridge, and it's just not fun, which is why many developers just gave up. Question 2. What were the roadblocks for cross-designing games for both of these systems? The PS1's biggest roadblock was the texture warping. It can be mitigated pretty easily, just tessellate the polygons as they come closer to the camera. Of course, though, there are two problems with this approach. Firstly, you're wasting polygons. And secondly, some polygons that are pretty far away might get messed up if they're at an extreme angle, but tessellating them can cause other problems, specifically performance ones. The solution to this problem is complicated. Well, some games just use distance fog, some games, good games, use LODs. Spyro is basically the poster child for this, but what you would do is you would load in the main level, but also have a second, low-quality version of the level without the textures. The PS1 draws untextured polygons twice as fast as textured ones, so this way, you just draw the things in the distance quickly, and because it's hard to notice warping with colors, you don't waste that many polygons drawing the LOD version. So this way, you have more polygons to use for things close up to the camera, so the game looks better. And of course, this also eliminates the fog issue. This was of course pretty difficult for developers to implement, though some did with great results. The N64's biggest bottleneck was the complex RAM bottlenecked architecture. Many functions that were reliable and fast on the PS1 would just kill performance on an N64, simply because they read from RAM a lot. And when games were just made for the N64, the console was still really difficult to dev for, and when time is limited, a lot of developers just said screw it and cut a feature or two from the N64 version in order to get the game shipped out in time. Nowadays, many homebrew developers like Kaze have shown how much the N64 could do when you really have a developer that completely knows what they're doing, but on the topic of homebrew, I'd like to get something out of the way. Comparing homebrew versus homebrew is fine, but I prefer to compare official games to official games. Homebrew is like the sort of best of postmortem. They're often vertical slices of games without the real meat and potatoes that the full game has with all the limitations and conditions, so I don't think it's that fun to compare them. By the way, did you know that somebody ported FNAF to the PS1? Now, let's get to the game questions, but before we do, a quick word of warning. We are not comparing like for like, but we'll be comparing games in a more abstract way. When we ask if a system could do a game, we're not looking for a one-to-one conversion, but something that would pass the duck test. Something that would be the game, maybe not one-to-one, but close enough to where you could say it's the same game. So, let's go through the following example. Could the PS1 do a game like Mario 64? Well, I think the answer is a pretty clear yes. Take Spyro, change him for Mario, and there you go. Of course, Spyro's level design is different, but you could sort of port Mario 64's levels into Spyro, provided you manually redesign the levels entirely in a way that Spyro's engine could use them. But it could definitely be done. Could the N64 do a game like Final Fantasy? Yes and no. If you cut out all the sound effects, FMVs, crunched down all the textures, and replaced every FMV background with a black void, it could ballpark fit on a 64MB N64 cartridge, maybe, but it would cripple the game, so no, you would really not get anything resembling Final Fantasy VII, except Cloud running in a dark void. Could the PS1 do a game like Ocarina of Time? Yes. Even something as huge as Hyrule Field? Yes. Here's Terracan. You play as an alien dude, and look at the size of this place. It's insane. This game uses an LOD system as well, and it's exactly what I wanted out of a game, at least on a technical level. The levels are huge, but still dense with enemies. Objects can be dynamically placed and even leave dents in the terrain as they explode. It's just so cool. So you can imagine how if we slow down the gameplay, zoomed in a little bit, gave the guy a sword, and made him fight enemies his size in a more level and inland area, we would have something relatively similar to the Ocarina of Time play areas, and then you just have to port the mechanics, which aren't very hard to port. Then, of course, instead of loading into levels and outer levels with a ship, you would just have loading zones that are gonna send you to another part of the world immediately, and that's not that hard to do, and then you'd basically be there already. Ocarina of Time is more than possible on the PS1. It could even have better pre-rendered backgrounds, better sound, and even pre-rendered cutscenes in some places. But what about the previously stated games like DK64 or Majora's Mask? Well, obviously, as I said before, that's really nothing that a loading zone or data streaming can't fix. Interestingly enough, Driver 2 is quite the interesting side note. It's a PS1 game with an absurdly large world, all streamed from disk of course, but here's something interesting. The game contains 2 discs with a lot of FMVs. So I decided to open up the game files and see how big just the game files really were. So just the level and mission data for the 4 cities were a total of 100 megabytes. So Driver 2 would basically be impossible on the N64, as the largest cartridge was 64 megabytes. Then the sound is another 20 megabytes, and the graphics only seem to be about another 2 megabytes, while the assets are another 6.2. Actually, wait a minute. How do other PS1 games compare? Okay, so Tomb Raider 2 released in 1997, and its levels add up to about 40 megabytes. This wouldn't be an issue if 48, 56, or 64 megabyte cartridges existed in 1997, but they didn't. Tomb Raider 5's game data is 55 megabytes, but all the sound data adds up to a lot more than 64. I hope you're starting to get what I'm trying to say. It's often stated that the N64 cartridges weren't really an issue, because if you just used MIDI instead of Red Book music, and used an in-engine cutscene instead of an FMV, you could fit it onto the cartridge, but as you can see, that's clearly not the case. Just the level data of many early PS1 games were just too big to fit on early N64 cartridges, and late PS1 games, when you included the music, the sounds, etc., they were just also way too big to fit on even 64 megabyte cartridges. At the end of the day, there are some games that just won't run on either of these systems. You know, games like StarCraft 64, big RTS that couldn't use the 2 megabytes of RAM, they needed more. But on the N64, the cartridge was such a limiting factor that realistically, while most of the N64's library is possible on the PS1, a lot of the PS1's library would just not fit on an N64. Could you compress the data like with RE2? Well, you could try to compress the geometry. That's what Quake 1 and 2 did on the N64, and because of that, their loading times were on par, or in the case of Quake 1, worse than their disc-based counterpart. And even that won't help you when you need to compress down like 40 megabytes of level data onto a 16 megabyte cartridge, because you don't have 16 megabytes of space, you have even less because you have to shove in the engine, the graphics, the sounds, everything. It would have been basically impossible. This video started development as me just searching and writing down some things to show how these two systems were closer together than people thought, and they sort of are, but as you dig deeper, you just see how big of a disaster the cartridges were, and I find this stuff interesting, so I decided to share it with you. I also hope that seeing all of these technically impressive PS1 games made your eyes light up a bit, as this is what was already possible on the PS1 back in the day without the need for homebrew, so imagine what would be possible if people actually bothered to make PS1 homebrew that wasn't FNAF 2 on PS1. Like, I appreciate the effort, but why?